Hello, today we'll be going over the basic need-to-knows of hypothesis testing. Hypothesis testing involves drawing inferences about two contrasting propositions relating to the value of one or more population parameter. In hypothesis testing, we have the null hypothesis, also known as H0, which describes an existing theory. We also have the alternate hypothesis, also known as H1, which is the complement to the null hypothesis. After performing a hypothesis test, one will either reject the null hypothesis and support the alternate hypothesis, or fail to reject the null hypothesis and reject the alternate hypothesis. Before deciding to reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis, one must perform the hypothesis test procedure. The first step is to identify the population parameter and formulate the hypothesis to be tested. The second step is to select a significance level, which represents the risk of drawing an incorrect collusion. The third step is to determine the decision rule on which to base the conclusion. The fourth step is to calculate the test statistic, which we will speak more on later. And finally, we will apply the decision rule and draw a conclusion. The first step of the hypothesis testing procedure has to do with selecting the type of hypothesis. In hypothesis testing, there are three types of tests. We have an upper tail test, which is when the parameter is greater than the constant, a lower tail test, which is when the parameter is less than the constant, and a two-tail test, which is when the parameter is not equal to the constant. An example of an upper tail test would be trying to determine if a college graduate earns more than $60,000. An example of a lower tail test would be trying to determine if the United States national unemployment rate is less than 4%. An example of a two-tail test would be trying to determine if the average age of college students equals 21. Earlier, I mentioned test statistics, so which test statistic you use in a hypothesis test will depend on the type of test. So on this slide, we have listed the three types of one-sample test statistics. If you have a one-sample test where this population standard deviation is known, you will use the z-test statistic. If you have a one-sample test where the population standard deviation is unknown, you would use the t-test statistic. And if you have a one-sample test for a proportion, you will use this z-test statistic. Excel also has functions that can calculate the test statistic for hypothesis tests that have two or more samples. On this page, I have listed the 5 two-sample hypothesis test functions. We have a function for when the variance is known, a function for when the variance is unknown but equal, a function for when the variance is unknown and unequal, a formula for a paired two-sample test for means, and a formula for the equality of variances. After determining a test statistic, you would have to compare it to the critical value. As stated before, there are three types of hypothesis tests, and each test has a different rejection region. For a lower tail test, you would reject anything to the left of the critical value. For an upper tail test, you will reject anything to the right of a critical value. And for a two-tailed test, you would reject anything to the left and to the right of the two critical values. The last thing we will speak about is errors in hypothesis testing. In hypothesis testing, we can have 4 potential outcomes. 1. The null hypothesis is true, and we correctly fail to reject it. 2. the null hypothesis is false and we correctly reject it. 3. The null hypothesis is true and we incorrectly reject it. And 4. The null hypothesis is false and we incorrectly fail to reject it. When the null hypothesis is true and we incorrectly reject it, we have an example of a type I error. When the null hypothesis is false and we incorrectly fail to reject it, we have an example of a type 2 error. Let's take a prison sentence for example. We'll say the null hypothesis is a man being found guilty and the alternate hypothesis is a man being found innocent. A type I error would be a man being guilty but is found innocent, and a type 2 error would be a man being innocent but be found guilty.